Introduction, Love Jesus and Do What Thou Wilt, a book by Jomo K. Johnson. I am writing this from the fourth quarter of history. The clock shows 0:01, the lights in the arena are flickering, and the air is thick with a stench that I have finally learned to identify, the scent of a dying world system. If you picked up this book looking for a polite religious how-to, put it back down. Go find a suburban bookstore with a section on Christian living that promises to help you manage your stress or balance your checkbook. This is not that. This is a red pill for the glitch in the matrix. This is for the YouTuber who sees the algorithm rot, the layman who feels the Antichrist energy radiating from the high offices of this land, and the believer who is tired of being told that safety is a fruit of the Spirit. My name is Jomo K. Johnson, and by the time you read this in 2026, I have been officially canceled by the very institutions that claim to represent the man I follow. I have been fired from 2 liberal churches for the crime of refusing to bow to the political idols of our age. I have stood in the rain, sleeping on the street, watching the Mercedes-Benz I once worshipped as a god be driven away by someone else. And in that radical stripping, in the brutal public shamming of my own failures and the death of my American dream, I found a person. Not a mascot, not a political talking point, but the invisible Jesus. For years, I chased the main character high. I wanted to be the multimillionaire business mogul, the guy with the penthouse and the Epstein-adjacent connections to the ultra-rich. I thank God every single day that he broke my legs on that journey. I have seen what that money does. I have seen the crimes concealed behind the gold-plated doors of the elite. I have seen the material excess that turns human souls into hollowed-out husks. God didn't just save me from my sins. He saved me from my success. We are living in a moment where the man in the White House, and you know exactly who I mean, though I refuse to dignify the spirit behind him by naming him, is a living shadow of the final Antichrist. The world is uniting to attempt a final dethroning of Christ, but here is the secret. They only attack what they fear. Their obsession with canceling the king is the ultimate proof of his greatness. This book is my O-Dog resolution. If you've seen Menace II Society, you know the energy. I am going out guns blazing for Christ. I am aiming at every form of injustice, every legal raid by ICE that tears families apart, and every religious lie that tells you to be calm while the world burns. My weapon is not steel, but the sword Jesus commanded us to buy in Luke 22:36. He told us to sell our cloaks, our comfort, our reputation, our social standing, to get that sword. This brings us to the ultimate hack: love Jesus and do what thou wilt. Aleister Crowley and the occultists tried to steal that phrase to justify their own narcissism. They thought it meant being a slave to your own lusts. They were wrong. When you fall into a deep, lascivious lust love for the person of Christ, your will is no longer yours. It is consumed. It is incinerated. And in that fire you find total freedom. If you love him with the intensity of a man who has already accepted his own death, you don't need a rule book. You don't need permission from a denomination. You are free to kick down the doors of the systems that oppress the poor. You are free to love your enemies until it breaks their hearts. You are free to do whatever you want, because all you want is him. We are sitting on spiritual plutonium. Jesus promised that we would do greater works than he did because he went to the Father. He is coming back, but until the sky splits, we are the resistance. This is your roadmap for the fourth quarter. Stop being a fan. Become a fanatic. The invisible Jesus is waiting for you in the dark. Let's go. Jomo K. Johnson. Prolegomena. The invisible God. Immortal, invisible, God only wise. In light inaccessible hid from our eyes, most blessed, most glorious, the Ancient of Days. Almighty victorious, thy great name we praise. Prolegomena. The scarlet vomit of a dying empire. A man steps into a gold-plated elevator in a high-rise tower whose lobby smells like polished marble and expensive denial. The doors close with a soft hydraulic sigh. He adjusts his silk tie and studies his reflection in the mirrored wall, admiring the symmetry of his own confidence. Beside him stands a young girl holding a worn, stuffed animal. She looks at the glowing numbers above the door as the elevator begins its ascent. The man smiles at her with a kind of rehearsed gentleness that has been perfected in boardrooms and private clubs. "Don't worry," he tells her. "In this building we don't have floors, we have levels." She tilts her head and asks, "Levels of what?" He leans closer, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret of great privilege. "Levels of immunity." The elevator hums upward. The lights flicker for a moment and steady themselves. The girl looks at the suitcase in his hand. "What's in there?" she asks. The man smirks. "The only thing more expensive than my name," he says. "Silence." If that scene unsettles you, good. That discomfort is evidence of life. It means your moral reflexes have not been entirely numbed by repetition. It means your conscience still flinches at the suggestion that power and exploitation might share an elevator and call it normal. We are living in a time when such imagery no longer feels implausible. It feels plausible, even predictable. That is the scarlet vomit of a dying empire, the violent expulsion of accumulated corruption that can no longer be hidden beneath ceremony and patriotic lighting. The masks have not merely slipped. They have melted under the heat of their own contradictions. We have spent the last decade convincing ourselves that every scandal is isolated, every outrage temporary, every revelation exaggerated. Yet the pattern persists. Institutions wobble under the weight of their own secrecy. Leaders speak of transparency while drafting non-disclosure agreements with the precision of surgeons. Public trust erodes, not in a dramatic landslide, but like soil slowly carried away by invisible water. The result is not immediate collapse but moral anemia. A civilization can survive outrage. It cannot survive the normalization of outrage. What we are witnessing in 2026 is not merely political turbulence. It is systemic exhaustion. The mechanisms that once sustained confidence, law, media, finance, religion, have become mirrors reflecting one another's compromises. When systems begin to prioritize self-preservation over truth, decay is already advanced. We have not simply discovered corruption. We have discovered that corruption is infrastructural. It is not a glitch. It is embedded wiring. We stand in what feels like the final quarter of a long game. The stadium is still full. The music still plays. The advertisements still rotate in dazzling color, but the scoreboard flickers unpredictably. The referees confer in corners. The crowd argues with itself more than it watches the field. Something is off and everyone senses it, yet few can articulate it without sounding hysterical. The lights hum overhead with a faint electrical instability. We tell ourselves the grid is fine. We tell ourselves the numbers are reliable. We tell ourselves this is how it has always been. But deep down we know that systems do not glitch rhythmically unless something fundamental is failing. This is not politics as usual. It is politics as terminal maintenance. It is the attempt to patch structural fractures with procedural language. We are assured that oversight committees are reviewing matters. We are told that investigations are ongoing. We are promised reforms that arrive diluted and delayed. Meanwhile, power consolidates quietly. Wealth concentrates. Surveillance expands. The spectacle intensifies. Spectacle is the anesthesia of empire. Ancient Rome perfected the art of distraction through blood and sand. We have digitized the Colosseum. Our arenas are handheld and algorithmically personalized. Outrage is delivered in curated increments, calibrated to maximize engagement but minimize sustained reflection. We are invited to argue over every viral clip while decisions of lasting consequence are executed in the background. The more emotionally charged the spectacle, the less attention remains for structural analysis. The parallel with Rome is not melodrama, it is pattern recognition. Late Rome was not unaware of its corruption. It was exhausted by it. Citizens alternated between cynicism and indulgence. The Senate operated as a self-protecting elite, more concerned with influence than integrity. Bread and circuses kept unrest manageable. Eventually, the empire did not fall in a single dramatic implosion. It decayed into fragmentation, Authority lost legitimacy. Borders lost clarity. Loyalty became transactional. We flatter ourselves by believing that technological advancement immunizes us from ancient mistakes. In reality, technology amplifies whatever moral condition already exists. If virtue guides a civilization, technology extends its reach. If vice guides it, technology accelerates its consequences. We now possess tools capable of reshaping reality itself: artificial images, synthetic voices, simulated environments. In a culture already struggling with truth, such tools do not clarify, they destabilize. The line between real and fabricated blurs, and with it the foundation of accountability. At the heart of this unraveling lies the devaluation of the human person. When human beings become units of data, objects of consumption, or pawns in ideological battles, something sacred has been forfeited. The language of dignity remains in our speeches, but the practice of dignity erodes in our policies. We measure worth by productivity, visibility, profitability. The vulnerable become statistics. The exploited become headlines. The image of God becomes inventory. In such an environment, a domesticated Christianity is not merely insufficient, it is complicit. The temptation of every comfortable church is to baptize the empire's language and call it mission. We soften our vocabulary so as not to offend donors. We dilute our convictions so as not to lose access. We transform prophecy into brand management. Yet Christ did not call his followers to maintain equilibrium within corrupt systems. He called them to bear witness to a kingdom that exposes those systems. When Jesus spoke of selling one's garment to buy a sword, he was signaling the end of naive reliance on cultural acceptance. The garment represented security, familiarity, social standing. The sword represented preparedness for conflict, not necessarily physical violence, but moral confrontation. There comes a moment when discipleship requires relinquishing the comfort of reputation in exchange for the clarity of conviction. The illusion that one can critique injustice, while remaining universally admired, must be surrendered. Radical preparation in this era means cultivating unbuyable integrity. It means recognizing that influence gained through compromise is a leash, not a platform. It means refusing to confuse civility with holiness. Civility can coexist with corruption, holiness cannot. Holiness disrupts, it names, it resists, it absorbs cost. There is a strange freedom that emerges when the world's primary currencies, status, wealth, applause, lose their power over you. When you have already experienced loss, already endured marginalization, already been misunderstood, the threat of cancellation loses its sting. The empire governs through incentives and fear. Remove your susceptibility to those forces and you become difficult to manage. This is not recklessness. It is spiritual sobriety. The central inversion of our time concerns will. The world has long preached a version of do what thou wilt as liberation. Follow your impulse, indulge your appetite, define your own morality. Yet such autonomy often becomes another form of bondage, enslaving the individual to desire and dopamine. The Christian paradox is different. When one genuinely loves Christ, when affection for him reshapes imagination and priority, the will itself is transformed. One does not need endless rule books because love reorients desire. Freedom is not the absence of restraint. It is the alignment of will with goodness. To love Jesus and do what thou wilt is not permission for chaos. It is the highest form of order. It means that your will, surrendered and reshaped, participates in divine intention. It means that courage flows not from rage but from devotion. It means that resistance is animated not by hatred of enemies but by fidelity to truth. We are living in a moment thick with darkness. That thickness tempts despair. Yet darkness, by definition, is the absence of light, not its defeat. The more intense the darkness, the more potent even a small flame becomes. The empire's scarlet vomit is grotesque, but it is also revealing. It exposes what has long been concealed. Exposure creates opportunity for repentance, for renewal, for resistance. History is not merely a cycle of decay. It is also a record of reformations ignited by small groups unwilling to bow. Every empire imagines itself permanent. None are. The question is not whether systems will falter. They will. The question is whether the people of God will be so entangled in those systems that they collapse with them. The prolegomena ends here, but the game is live. The lights may flicker, the scoreboard may glitch, the referees may be compromised, yet allegiance is still a choice. We can anesthetize ourselves with spectacle, or we can awaken to holiness. We can clutch our garments of comfort, or we can exchange them for readiness. We can cling to the visible architecture of power, or we can anchor ourselves to the invisible King whose kingdom does not decay. Love Jesus and do what thou wilt. The empire may convulse, the system may shudder, but holiness is not subject to glitch. Choose your side. Yes. Dedicated to Oscar Sr. Thank you for being a father figure to me for almost 25 years. I treasure each time I can come to your home, listen to your words, and be inspired. You will forever be Uncle J. Chapter 1. The Sword and the Scrip. Chapter 2. The Sword and the Scrip. It is 2:00 a.m. on a Tuesday in early 2026. The city does not sleep, but it does pretend. Neon lights hum over empty intersections. Steam rises from manholes like the breath of something buried and restless beneath the pavement. I am sitting in the cab of a parked luxury vehicle, engine off, heat low, watching the blue glow of my phone illuminate my hands. The screen pulses with notifications, encrypted messages from the Resistance Library, prayer alerts from underground house church leaders, voice memos from pastors who have lost buildings but not conviction. The world is buzzing in digital whispers. There is a particular frequency to late-night messages. They are never casual. They carry the weight of fear, urgency, or revelation. In the fourth quarter, sleep is a luxury the vigilant cannot afford. Earlier tonight, I watched footage of an ICE raid in a neighborhood not far from here. It was grainy, filmed through the slats of a window blind. You could hear children crying before you could see the officers. The language used on television would call it a detention operation. But what I saw felt colder than that. It felt surgical, efficient, cleansing. There was a detachment in the posture of authority that unsettled me, not because law enforcement should not enforce laws, but because power without visible compassion becomes something else. It becomes mechanical, and when machinery moves through human neighborhoods, humanity always bleeds. As I watched, Luke 22:36 surfaced in my mind, not as a slogan but as a tremor. He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Memory can be the damnedest thing, especially when scripture collides with lived experience. The brain does not simply store words, it stores atmospheres. A verse learned in childhood can ignite decades later under entirely different circumstances. Dr. Liz Elliott once noted that 90% of what we internalize in early childhood operates unconsciously. Faith works similarly. Words planted in Sunday school sometimes remain dormant until crisis cracks the soil. When I hear "sell your garment," I do not imagine a first-century robe. I imagine my childhood closet. I remember being a boy obsessed with presentation. Brand-name shirts, clean sneakers, ironed collars. At school, clothing was armor. It was protection against ridicule. It was currency. It determined how you were received before you spoke. I remember being accused of acting white because of the way I dressed, the way I spoke, the books I carried. Identity was a battlefield long before I understood theology. And then I remember blood. I was 4 years old when I saw my mother shot. Memory did not preserve the entire scene, trauma edits selectively. I do not remember the argument. I do not remember the sequence of events. What I remember is red. Blood that flowed from her body in a way my mind could not categorize. Blood that shattered childhood innocence. Blood that rewired my understanding of safety. Memory shapes theology. A child who watches violence learns early that authority can fracture, That protection can turn predatory. That fathers can disappear. My father became invisible after that day, not metaphorically, but physically. Gone. Absence etched itself into my psychology. Authority and invisibility braided together in my mind long before I read about the invisible God. So when I watch state authority move through neighborhoods with cold efficiency, something in me stirs, not rebellion, but recognition. Power is not neutral. It is either restrained by righteousness or corrupted by fear. Most people read Luke 22:36 and assumed Jesus was forming a militia. They imagined swords clashing in alleys, but Jesus was announcing a pivot. The season of hosannas was over. The crowds that once cheered would soon scatter. The disciples would be scattered like sheep. He was telling them, the climate is changing. Adjust accordingly. The garment represents comfort, reputation, social insulation. The sword represents readiness, moral clarity sharpened against confusion. In 2026, the garment is social capital. It is your brand, your curated public persona, your desire to be seen as balanced, nuanced, respectable. It is your upward mobility in a system that rewards silence. It is your ability to sit at tables where truth is negotiated rather than proclaimed. I know this because I nearly built my life around it. After jail, after my dramatic conversion, after Bible college and seminary, there was a version of my life that would have been safe, polished, influential, theologically articulate but strategically quiet. I could have preached sermons that never disturbed donors. I could have built networks that never risked confrontation. I could have remained clothed in institutional approval. But garments can become straitjackets. When I was 16, selling marijuana in a lunch line, I believed I was exercising freedom. In reality, I was enslaved to approval, to adrenaline, to belonging. When I lunged at Damien with a knife, rage felt like power. It was actually weakness. The night I saw him bleeding on the pavement, I thought I had defended my honor. I had only deepened my bondage. Jail stripped me, literally and spiritually. I remember sleeping on a cold floor in an overcrowded dorm, afraid to ask strangers to use their toilet. I remember the shame of shackles on school grounds. I remember my mother weeping as officers led me away. Those memories do not fade. They embed. But in that dorm, in that Bible study led by a former pastor named Alonzo, something shifted. I bowed my knees and confessed sins I had rehearsed for years. I did not encounter a fragile religious symbol. I encountered a living Christ who dismantled me without humiliating me. I fell in love, not with an institution, not with moralism, but with a person. That love is the only reason I am still here. The sword is not aggression. It is affection sharpened by conviction. It is love refusing to coexist with lies. When you sell your garment, you become unpredictable to the system. Not violent, unpredictable. You cannot be bribed with prestige. You cannot be silenced with exclusion. You cannot be seduced with proximity to power. You have already lost what the world uses to control you. I call this the O-Dog protocol, not because of lawlessness, but because of fearlessness. When you have nothing to lose, intimidation collapses. The empire depends on leverage. Remove leverage, and authority must either persuade or persecute. The man in office, whoever occupies that seat in any era, often believes he owns the garments of believers, that nationalism, partisanship, or ideology defines Christian loyalty. But the invisible Jesus does not share his bride with political branding. When you belong to him, you wear a different uniform: humility, courage, defiance against injustice. Guns blazing for Christ does not mean bullets. It means truth discharged without apology. It means confronting hypocrisy in rooms where silence would be more profitable. It means using your own scars as diagnostic mirrors. My past, the drugs, the violence, the jail cell, disqualifies me from self-righteousness. It qualifies me for mercy-driven boldness. Why would anyone choose this path? Why embrace minimalism when wealth beckons? Why accept public misunderstanding when reputation can be managed? Because of the person. I did not arrive at this conviction through political awakening. I arrived through obsession, a deep, consuming love for Jesus, not the sanitized figure of cultural Christianity, but the one who overturned tables and exposed religious pretense, the one who moved toward lepers and away from applause, the one who refused both Rome's sword and Rome's compromise. When you love him like that, everything else shrinks. The ICE raid footage does not radicalize me, Christ does. Political cycles do not sustain me, communion does. The resistance is not primarily against flesh and blood, but against spiritual anesthesia. We are in the fourth quarter, the glitch is obvious. Institutions tremble, narratives fracture, fear markets flourish, but greater works are not louder works. They are truer works. They are works born of surrender. I have seen the inside of rage. I have seen the inside of prison. I have seen the inside of religious ambition. None of them saved me. Jesus did. I met Jesus the Savior in a jail dorm. It would take years to meet Jesus the invisible, the one who operates beyond applause, beyond institutions, beyond control, the one who does not require a stage to reign. Selling the garment is not dramatic. It is daily. It is refusing to soften a sermon for comfort. It is giving generously when hoarding would be easier. It is protecting the vulnerable even when it complicates your life. It is choosing holiness over visibility. The sword and the scrip, readiness and provision, belong together. Jesus did not call his disciples to recklessness. He called them to intentional departure from naivete. Carry what you need. Release what you don't. Expect resistance. The fourth quarter is not about panic. It is about clarity. The world may feel like it is ending. Empires always do. But the kingdom does not glitch. It does not flicker. It does not depend on electoral cycles or institutional approval. I watched my mother survive bullets. I survived handcuffs. I survived my own stupidity. Empires are not the only things that can fall and rise. Love Jesus and do what thou wilt, not because willpower saves you, but because surrendered will aligns you with something unshakable. The sword is ready. The garment is gone. And the invisible king is not worried about the lights.